In June of 1859, three prospectors working a played-out gold claim on the eastern slope of Mount Davidson in the Utah Territory hit something that stopped them cold, a heavy blue-gray mud, clogging their sluice box, mud that assayed, once a sample reached California, at nearly $3,000 a ton in silver. The men were Henry Comstock, Patrick McLaughlin, and Peter O'Reilly, and none of them understood yet what they had found, or that Comstock, a talker more than a digger, would attach his own name to the discovery through sheer persistence and leave almost nothing behind for himself. What they had found was the crown of a silver body that would within 2 decades pull upward of $300 million from the ground at 1860s prices, help push a territory into statehood 8 months early so its electoral votes could reach Washington in time for a wartime election, and scatter across the high desert of western Nevada dozens of towns built to hold that wealth. Virginia City, the camp that grew up directly over the strike, reached its peak in 1873, when 4 mining investors known locally as the Bonanza Kings, John Mackay, James Fair, James Flood, and William O'Brien, tapped a body of ore inside the consolidated Virginia and California mines, so rich that period assayers reportedly stopped believing their own instruments and reran the samples twice before reporting the figures upward. The find became known as the Big Bonanza, and it alone is credited with producing more than $100 million in silver and gold before the ore body narrowed and gave out by the early 1880s. Most of the towns that grew up on wealth like that are gone now. A surprising number of their vaults are not. What survives in a Nevada mining camp after the ore runs out follows a pattern anyone who has walked these sites will recognize. The wood goes first, torn down for lumber in the next boom, or burned in the fires that took entire main streets in a single night, which was common enough in towns lit by kerosene and built shoulder to shoulder. The false front hotels go. The saloons go. What remains standing, sometimes alone in open sagebrush with nothing around it for 100 yards, is the bank, or more precisely, the vault inside it. Poured concrete 4 to 6 inches thick, reinforced with iron strap or rebar depending on the decade, fronted with a steel door forged in San Francisco or Chicago, and freighted in by mule team at a cost that occasionally ran higher than the building wrapped around it. A vault was built to survive fire, theft, and the eventual collapse of everything near it. In town after town across the state, that is exactly what it did. Rhyolite shows the pattern at its most photographed. The town rose fast after a gold and silver strike in 1904, and by 1908 had electric light, a stock exchange, and a 3-story bank building on its main street, built of poured concrete faced with imported glass, the largest structure for 100 miles in any direction. The Bullfrog District's ore proved thinner than early assays suggested, capital pulled out within 3 years, and by 1911, the town's own newspaper had stopped printing. What tourists photograph today is the shell of that bank, walls standing without a roof, window frames without glass, and at the base of it the vault chamber itself, door still on its hinges, one of the only parts of the building that required no restoration to remain recognizable for exactly what it was built to be. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. Pioche is one of the clearer examples. Silver was found in the hills above the settlement of Pioche in the early 1860s, reported by a Mormon rancher named William Hamblin, who had no mining interest of his own and sold word of the discovery for what accounts describe as a rifle and little else. By the 1870s, Pioche was producing enough bullion to be called, in period newspapers, the richest and most violent camp in the American West, a claim supported by a Boot Hill cemetery that grew faster than the town's legitimate death rate could explain, and by a jail built before the town had a church. The bust came the way it usually did, ore quality falling, transport costs rising, capital moving to the next strike, and a second, smaller revival around the turn of the century that never matched the first boom's output. Pioche never fully emptied the way some of its neighbors did. It shrank instead, decade after decade, until the buildings that had briefly held one of the largest concentrations of silver wealth in the territory stood mostly unused, their vaults intact behind doors nobody had reason to open, some of them incorporated later into county offices that still operate a short walk from stone walls that once held the payroll for thousands of miners. Delamar, 40 miles south, tells the harder version of the same story. Discovered in the late 1880s and developed through the 1890s by an investor named John Delamar, the town's ore had to be dry drilled, the rock too hard and too far from water for the wet drilling methods used elsewhere, and the silica dust thrown up by dry drilling settled into miners' lungs and killed them within a few years of steady work. The camp earned the name the Widowmaker before it earned much else, and coroner's records from the period, thin as they are, list lung disease among miners in their 20s and 30s at a rate that would have shut the operation down under any later regulatory regime. When the water finally ran out entirely around 1909, milling became impossible, and the town emptied fast, in months rather than decades. What was left behind included a masonry vault that still stands today, isolated, roofless, the building around it long since stripped for materials by later prospectors and later still by scavengers who wanted nothing from the vault itself, because by then, everyone who might have known its combination was dead or gone. The pattern repeats at Belmont, where the 1874 Nye County Courthouse still stands roofless above a town site otherwise reduced to foundations, and at a dozen smaller camps whose names survive mainly on Bureau of Land Management markers rather than on any map printed after the 1920s. A boom, a bank, a vault, built heavier than anything else in town, and then decline that leaves the vault as the last thing standing, not because anyone sealed it deliberately, but because nobody after a certain point had a reason to. These are not hidden discoveries. They are photographed, catalogued, visited by ghost town tourists with cameras every season, written up in State Historical Society pamphlets that anyone can request by mail. The historical record on them is thin only in the sense that nobody thought a bank vault needed a biography while the town around it was alive. The federal order most often invoked in connection with these sites is real, and it deserves to be named precisely, because the precision is where the actual history lives. On October 8, 1942, the War Production Board issued Limitation Order L208, directing gold mines across the United States to cease normal operation. This was not a silver order, and it was not a Nevada order specifically. It targeted gold because gold, unlike silver, copper, lead, zinc, tungsten, or mercury, had no direct application to weapons production, and the labor, dynamite, steel, and rail capacity tied up in gold mining was judged more valuable, redirected to metals the war effort actually needed. Hundreds of mines went dark within weeks, and mine operators who protested were told plainly that the order was not open to appeal on economic grounds, only on the narrow question of whether a given operation produced strategic minerals as a byproduct significant enough to exempt it. In Nevada, where many operations pulled gold and silver from the same ore body, the order forced closures at camps that had, in some cases, limped along in reduced form since the 1890s. Miners were reassigned to strategic metals operations or drafted outright, and equipment that had run for 60 years sat idle under canvas because there was no longer a legal path to running it. Some of these towns, already thin, emptied out for good during those war years, their last residents leaving, not because of legend, but because of a printed order from Washington that most of them likely never read in full. Silver was treated differently. Unlike gold, it had a wartime industrial role, used in brazing alloys, in electrical contacts, in the percussion caps of small arms ammunition manufactured by the bullion round, and its mining and refining continued through the war years largely unrestricted by an order comparable to L208. That distinction, gold suppressed as non-essential while silver kept moving, is where the record turns towards something considerably stranger than a mining camp closure, and considerably better documented. By 1942, the Manhattan Engineer District needed to build an electromagnetic separation plant at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to enrich uranium for a weapon that did not yet exist, and that almost nobody involved in supplying its parts was told anything about. The Calutrons at the heart of that plant, essentially oversized mass spectrometers scaled up to industrial size, were arranged in giant oval structures the workers on site nicknamed racetracks, and each racetrack depended on magnetic field coils built from windings of conductive metal wrapped around the structure in quantities measured in thousands of tons per unit, with dozens of units required to run the plant at production scale. Copper was the obvious choice for that winding, and copper was also, in 1942, committed almost entirely to shell casings, artillery driving bands, and electrical wiring for a military mobilizing on two fronts at once. The War Production Board had already restricted copper allocation to a point where ordinary industrial buyers were substituting other metals wherever engineering allowed it. There was not enough copper to spare for a plant whose purpose could not even be disclosed to the officials being asked to solve the shortage, and there was no time to wait for new copper production to catch up to demand. Colonel Kenneth Nichols, the district engineer under General Leslie Groves, approached the Treasury Department instead, because silver conducts electricity nearly as well as copper, and because the United States Treasury, by 1942, was sitting on one of the largest silver reserves ever assembled by any government in history, much of it bullion that had originated decades earlier in exactly the kind of Nevada ore bodies described above, refined, stamped, and stacked in federal depositories under the Silver Purchase Act programs of the 1930s. Nichols met with Under-Secretary of the Treasury Daniel Bell to request the loan. What followed, according to accounts later given by participants in post-war interviews and Manhattan Project histories, involved a request measured not in dollars but in troy ounces, because the volume being discussed, roughly 14,000 tons, was so large that pricing it in dollars made the number itself sound like an error. The transfer began in 1942 and continued into 1943, conducted under wartime secrecy classifications that kept even the destination of the silver unknown to most of the Treasury personnel who authorized its release. Bars and coin stock moved out of federal vaults, principally the depository at West Point, under armed escort, without public announcement, without a press release, and without the paperwork trail that would ordinarily accompany the movement of a national reserve of that scale. Some of the metal moved as raw bullion and some as recalled silver coin, melted at the mint before shipment so that no denomination or date could later tie a bar of finished bus bar back to circulating currency. The silver was shipped to fabricating plants in the industrial Northeast, cast into massive bus bars and cable, wound into the racetrack coils that would power the Calutrons at Y-12, and installed in a facility whose function remained classified for the duration of the war, guarded by a security apparatus large enough to have its own internal police force and its own fenced perimeter separate from the rest of the Oak Ridge Reservation. The vaults that had held the silver were not sealed by rumor or legend. They were emptied by direct federal order, under a level of secrecy that meant the full extent of what had left them was not publicly reconciled for years afterward. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. The silver was, technically, a loan, and the government treated it as one, with unusual rigor, given everything else about the project's secrecy. After the war, the Atomic Energy Commission inherited the obligation to return it, and the recovery process ran for decades, silver being scraped from old coil windings, melted, assayed, and returned to Treasury custody in installments through the 1950s and 60s, with the final major reconciliation not completed until 1970, 25 years after the war that had required the loan in the first place ended. Some of the racetrack coils sat in place at Oak Ridge for years after the war, before they were finally dismantled for their silver, the plant having moved on to other separation methods, while the original 1943 windings simply stayed in the walls, still government property, still uncounted. For a brief period, some of the physical silver bus bar that had once carried current through the Calutrons was even sold as scrap, by contractors who did not immediately grasp what they were holding, a detail confirmed years later when auditors traced discrepancies in the returned tonnage back to sales nobody had cleared through proper channels. A national reserve built up over a century of mining, some of it hauled out of the ground within sight of towns like Pioche and Delamar, had been quietly disassembled, shipped under guard, wound into secret machinery, and then just as quietly reassembled, ounce by ounce, over a generation. No single named individual carried this story the way a lone prospector or a lone engineer carries the stories these documentaries usually tell, and that absence is itself worth sitting with. The people who authorized the transfer, Nichols, Groves, Bell, and the handful of Treasury and War Production Board officials briefed on it, left behind a record that is unusually complete for a wartime secret, memoranda, interviews, and post-war audits that account, almost to the ounce, for where the silver went and when it came back. Groves himself wrote about the arrangement plainly enough in his post-war memoir, treating it less as a dramatic episode than as one more supply problem solved among hundreds, which is itself a measure of how routine the machinery of wartime secrecy had become by 1942. Compare that to the vaults standing empty in the Nevada desert, where no order was ever issued, no memorandum was ever filed, and no one now living can say with certainty who last turned the combination or why they stopped. The federal government's silver was tracked with a precision bordering on obsession because it never stopped being government property even while it was buried inside a secret weapon. The silver that came out of Nevada's ground a century ago left no comparable trail once it passed out of the mining camps themselves, dispersing into coinage, industry, and eventually, unknowingly, into a war machine most of the men who dug it were long dead before it was built. What is left to see today is two kinds of empty vault standing on opposite ends of the same metal's history. In the Nevada desert, concrete boxes with their doors still hanging, holding nothing, closed by economics and time, rather than by any order, visited now mostly by photographers, and by the kind of traveler who reads a Bureau of Land Management sign and wonders what a bank vault is doing 40 miles from the nearest bank, the paint on the sign fresher than anything else within sight of it. And at West Point, and in the reconstructed Treasury ledgers that took 25 years to balance, a different kind of empty vault, one that really was sealed by federal order in the specific years this story keeps returning to, 1942 into 1943, its contents accounted for down to the ounce, its purpose classified, until long after the metal itself had gone back into the ground it came from, in the form of coin and bullion once again, indistinguishable from silver that had never left. One vault kept no record because no one was left to keep it. The other kept a record so complete that a historian today can reconstruct, almost to the week, when a specific bar of silver left West Point and when its equivalent weight came home. The desert vaults ask nothing of anyone who finds them. They are not evidence of anything hidden, only of towns that lived hard and briefly and left behind the one part of themselves too expensive to tear down. Stand inside one of them today, and the silence is simply the silence of an empty concrete room, no different from any other, until you remember what a room like this one was built to hold and what it cost, in 1860s dollars or 1940s secrecy, to move that much silver anywhere at all. The Treasury vaults, by contrast, are the rare case where the paperwork survived the secrecy, where a nation's most guarded metal was tracked so carefully that historians today can say, with more confidence than they can say almost anything else about 1943, exactly how much silver left, exactly where it went, and exactly when the last ounce came home. Between those two records sits the quieter truth this story keeps circling. The most remarkable thing that happened to American silver during the Second World War was never hidden at all. It was simply classified, which is a different thing, and which, eventually, comes with an ending the desert vaults will never get. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.